And we're going to start with Mary Triece, who unfortunately could not be with us in person today, but is with us through video. Her presentation is self-explanatory, doesn't need any introduction by me. Mary Triece has been a part of a previous panel, as has Ahmed, when we our third LaborFest at the Max Hayes new adults or new technical school, where we celebrated the lives and contributions of Max Hayes and John McBride. And we thought we'd ask her back again. She originally was going to appear in person, then something I think came up and she couldn't do it. So here we go.
Good afternoon. My name is Mary Triece. I'm a professor and the director of the Women's Studies program at the University of Akron. Today I'd like to talk a bit about women's experiences in the industrial workers of the world. Women workers have always organized on their own behalf and often in the face of innumerable obstacles. Cultural norms positioned white women as mothers and homemakers. Institutionalized racism relegated black women to traditionally non-unionized work in the fields and as domestic servants. And both black and white women often faced hostility from male comrades who viewed them as competition for scarce jobs or as out of place in the paid labor force. In this context, the industrial workers of the world provided a space for women to organize alongside men for fair wages and safe working conditions. Still, within the IWW, women workers faced obstacles due to their sex, and they often saw different goals from their male comrades. Today, I'd like to shed light on their experiences told from their own perspectives, which often go unseen or unappreciated in accounts of the IWW. In 1905, the industrial workers of the world formed with the intent of organizing unskilled workers, black workers, women, and immigrants into one great industrial union founded on class struggle. Many are familiar with the efforts of IWW activists such as Bill Haywood, Carlo Tresca, and Joe Hill. Women were also involved in the IWW from its inception and remained tireless as organizers, advocates, and activists. Many of them, like Lucy Parsons, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, Mary Harris Mother Jones, Jane Street, and Sophie Beldner, contributed writings to IWW publications like The Liberator, Solidarity, and Industrial Union Bulletin, and they led walkouts and strikes throughout the early 20th century. Countless others whose names are lost to posterity played pivotal roles as strikers and as wives and daughters supporting their male brethren on the picket line and in labor confrontations. If we look at their writings and speeches, we see how women had to negotiate the at times conflicting issues of class and sex oppression. They lived at the intersection of both and ignored neither. Throughout the first 2 decades of the 1900s, Lucy Parsons defended women's rights to control their own bodies and lives, even as she addressed class solidarity. Parsons was remarkably outspoken and forward-thinking during a period when women were legally deemed the property of their husbands. Parsons admonished men to relinquish their hold on patriarchal power in the home. She wrote in The Liberator in October 1905, quote, "The new woman has made her bow upon the stage of life's activities as an independent human being, and she feels her importance. She feels very different from her man-tagged sisters of past generations who imagined they couldn't move without man's assistance. The sooner men learn to make companions and equals of their wives and not subordinates, the sooner the marriage relation will be one of harmony." Unquote. Still, Parsons remained acutely aware of the need for sex solidarity in labor's fights. In 1912, she called on the working class to, quote, "heed the call of the IWW and cease to labor on the first day of May," unquote, in the fight for the 8-hour workday. She urged workers to consider, quote, "if it is worthwhile for them to spend 3/4 of their time toiling for bare existence, not for a living, for the vast majority of them do not live, they barely exist," unquote. Like Parsons, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who is known as the Rebel Girl, addressed concerns specific to women which were often overlooked by IWW men, including women's right to birth control, divorce, and political enfranchisement. Like Parsons, Flynn addressed the patriarchal nature of marriage and family, even as she urged women to fight alongside men for equality. Writing in 1916, Flynn lamented the, quote, loveless marriages, household drudgery, acceptance of loathsome familiarities, and unwelcome childbearing that have marred the mind, body, and spirit of women, unquote. When Flynn was in her 20s, she and hundreds of other women figured prominently as wives, mothers, and workers in the well-known strike of textile workers in Lawrence, Massachusetts. This was when tens of thousands of men, women, and children went on strike to protest wage cuts. As wives and mothers who were primarily responsible for child rearing, Lawrence women witnessed their children starve on diets of bread and molasses. In fact, the infant mortality rate in Lawrence at that time was 172 out of 1,000. So women were angry and ready to fight on behalf of their families. They boycotted unsympathetic stores and placed scab signs on the doors of stores that refused credit to strikers. From fourth floor windows, women taunted scabs and poured scalding water on neighbors headed to work as scabs. Wives went after scabs with pots and pans, rolling pins, and even rocks. On one occasion, IWW leader Bill Haywood recalled, quote, women caught a policeman in the middle of the bridge and stripped off all his uniform, pants and all. They were about to throw him in the icy river when other policemen rushed in and saved him from the chilly dunking, unquote. As part of her leadership in Lawrence, Flynn traveled the Midwest to raise strike funds, and she organized to have strikers' children sent to sympathizers in New York during the strike. Known as the Children's Crusade, this effort effectively called national attention to the deplorable living conditions of Lawrence families. Flynn also devoted special attention to organizing women as housewives and workers aware of male opposition to women's involvement in meetings and pickets. Flynn explained, quote, we knew that to leave women at home alone, isolated from the strike activity, a prey to worry, affected by the complaints of tradespeople, landlords, priests, and ministers, was a danger to the strike, unquote. In addition to the Lawrence strike, IWW women were active in the Akron rubber strike of 1913, despite the notable absence in Roy Wardman's account of the event, wherein Flynn is mentioned briefly for her address to Akron workers to organize, quote, from cellar to roof, unquote. But it wasn't just the well-known rebel girl who fought against the rubber robber barons. With similar fighting spirit as their Lawrence sisters, Akron women addressed crowds, they punished scabs, they raised essential funds to support striking families, and they stood alongside men on the picket line. On February 19, 1913, participating in what the Akron Beacon Journal called, quote, one of the largest demonstrations of the rubber strike to date, unquote, one woman, Margaret Prevey, along with 4 male comrades, addressed a crowd of 5,000 strikers and sympathizers at Grace Park. Showing contempt for workers on strike, one woman grabbed a dinner pail from the hands of a scab, causing the dishes to smash onto the sidewalk. The act prompted a crowd of strikers to cheer. Women's involvement in the Lawrence and Akron strikes is remarkable given the cultural climate of the time. Women were expected to remain domestic, submissive, and pious, and yet IWW women often demonstrated more feist than their male comrades. So we see from these brief examples that women were front and center in labor struggles, if not as workers, as wives and daughters of labor activists. Now I'd like to address some of the mixed results arising from the IWW's focus on class. On the one hand, the IWW's emphasis on class enabled the group to capture a wide audience of workers that had previously been ignored. even as that exclusive focus represented a weakness in organizing strategy. But their abilities to address the needs of women and minority workers often fell short. For instance, on day 2 of the IWW founding convention, Lucy Parsons called attention to the paucity of women's voices. She said, quote, "I've taken the floor because no other woman has responded," unquote. And she spoke to the importance of labor organizing specifically to women. She said, quote, "We, the women of this country, have no ballot, even if we wished to use it, and the only way that we can be represented is to take a man to represent us. You men have made such a mess of it in representing us that we have not much confidence in asking you. We have no ballot, but we have our labor," unquote. Parsons also urged the delegates to recognize and address the plight of women sex workers, which was very forward-thinking for the time. Additionally, throughout the early 1900s, the IWW failed to recruit women as members or as leaders in any meaningful numbers. And men often remained blind to the ways patriarchy influenced all corners of women's lives. In contrast, Flynn and fellow Wobbly Sophie Beldner saw the need to reach out to wives, mothers, and daughters who were isolated in the home, but whose savvy and support could greatly benefit labor actions. Sophie Beldner took on the IWW's exclusion of housewives as members by writing in the Industrial Union Bulletin in 1908, quote, "I believe the married woman of the working class is a social producer. In order to sustain herself, she has to sell her labor power either in the factory directly to the capitalist or at home indirectly by serving the wage slave, her husband, thus keeping him in working condition through cooking, washing, and general housekeeping. I believe the wage slave's wife has got a right to belong to a missed local. I think it should be encouraging for working men to see women enter their ranks and shoulder to shoulder fight for economic freedom," unquote. So in sum, we see that women's experiences in the IWW deserve singular attention for the ways these activists negotiated between speaking on behalf of their class and speaking up as women, a move that at times prompted hostile responses from husbands and even negligence from fellow Wobblies. In this regard, and in our present-day organizing efforts, we should recall the notion of intersectionality. It's the idea that women's needs and struggles for equality are shaped not only by their experiences as workers within a capitalist system, but as women within a patriarchal system, and for Black women as workers under institutionalized racism. The triple jeopardy of class, sex, and race oppression reinforced political marginalization, isolation in the home, and the double work shift for women. Thankfully, many historians have worked to position the contributions of women to the labor movement front and center, and we should continue in these efforts in order to provide a fuller understanding of all workers who continue to suffer workplace exploitation combined with sex and race injustice. Thank you.